we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time listening, welcome. If you want to support the podcast, go check us out on patreon.com/thebigmarkpodcast. You can follow us on Twitter, reach out to us on Instagram. If you want to suggest anything, let us know what you think of the podcast. Rate the podcast if you can. And if you listened to us before, welcome back. Today it's Tuesday night. I played a little golf today. Shout out my buddy B-Rye. Getting back in, sitting down, doing the podcast. I'm thinking, what are we going to, had my plan for today. And I was thinking how I'm going to kind of broach the subject, because it's a little bit of a different subject. Actually, funny enough, I've been listening to a podcast called the 10-Minute Podcast. Doesn't really exist anymore. Shout out Will Sasso. I know you're listening. Will Sasso, Chris D'Elia, and Brian Callen used to do his hilarious podcast called the 10-Minute Podcast. And actually, slowly but surely, as Callen and D'Elia kind of like went on and did their own thing, a couple new guys joined, Tommy Blacha and Chad Kulchin, and they kind of added another dynamic to the podcast and really brought in these crazy, outlandish, esoteric wrestling references. And, big fan of the podcast, and my buddy Mike Norman, he suggested me, next time, I'm thinking about doing a podcast, I should do something about professional wrestling. And I was thinking, oh man, really interesting. It's like, something that has kind of come in and out of popularity over the years. I'll kind of get into a little bit of the history of it, but when I was growing up, late 90s, early 2000s, it was kind of, making a little bit of a comeback, I guess you could say. But like anyone who was like really into wrestling was kind of like, a little bit like more hardcore. They were into like listening to like heavy metal and like getting into like more alternative lifestyle stuff, which is like super interesting. But I just never was really into that back in the day. And, again, even now it's kind of come into its own now. It's really interesting to play back and forth. And of course, we like to talk about sports a lot on this podcast. It's interesting to play back and forth with professional wrestling. Is it real? Is it fake? Obviously fake is kind of an interesting word, because, these guys are flying through the air. These guys and girls, these men and women are flying through the air, doing really athletic stuff. They're pushing their bodies to the limit. They're highly athletic, but fake, I guess, in the sense that a lot of the matches are decided before they're finished. So I guess that takes out the chance element of sports, that anything can happen. And I guess that's why sometimes people watch sports. I mean, I love watching March Madness, one of my favorite things to watch as far as sports is concerned. I love basketball, don't get me wrong, but just like the whole atmosphere and the tournaments and the tournament play, and like the fact that anything can happen, and one loss and you're out, all these other things kind of compound and create a really exciting sports experience. So again, with wrestling now, it's kind of been, outed as not real. But it still can be entertaining, which is really interesting. And, I kind of look at wrestling, and, some of it is really interesting because it's kind of like a soap opera in like the dramatics and the way it plays out. And I'll get into it a little bit. I guess certain wrestlers brought different personas and acting skills too, because obviously it's interesting with these wrestlers is that they have to be this balance between, extremely athletic, and, larger than life personality. And also there is like essentially acting involved. So, the more they want to sell it, obviously the better actor you have to be, right? So throughout the years, they got really amazing characters that were wrestlers and also became movie stars too. You know, obviously one of the biggest these days is Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. He got his career started in the WWF or in professional wrestling, I should say. And Hulk Hogan was in movies. Goldberg is a wrestler that I'll mention too. Again, a lot of wrestlers then become, and you know, they become villains in scary movies, or they become action stars too, which is really cool. So again, it's, you know, these athletes for sure also have this kind of acting skill, which is this really interesting thing. And, you know, we can kind of ponder that a little bit later, but I'll get into kind of the history of things here. If you look at professional wrestling, it is a performing art. So it's a performance art. And, you know, I mentioned it a little bit in comparing stand-up comedy and athleticism, and music for that matter. All those three kind of are similar in the sense that you are performing for somebody. You've practiced something and you're going out there and performing it. Obviously, athletics and sports being the furthest, more or less non-verbal aspect of things, but you know, dance and certain types of theater, it you know, doesn't necessarily require words for them to convey certain emotions. So again, it's a performing art. So professional wrestling started kind of in the early 20th century, with predecessors in funfair and variety strongman and wrestling performances. So, you know, like circuses, again, strongman competitions, you know, these larger than life characters kind of got around. And, you know, after World War II wasn't really as popular, you know, people probably weren't so interested in the violence again. But into the 50s and kind of the mid 50s, the first golden age, as it was referred to, of professional wrestling kind of started, and it was more or less in the US. And this is like the Gorgeous George era, Bobo Brazil, shout out Spenny, and then, like, you know, into those kind of old school wrestlers that inspired a lot of what they call the second golden age wrestlers too. Again, there was a second decline in public interest in the 70s and 80s, but with the advent of cable television in the mid 80s, there was again this second boom of interest in wrestling, because they used this new cable television technology to kind of spread this whole thing, right? So really cool. As it's known, the second golden age, these are where, again, I mentioned before, Hulk Hogan, Andre the Giant, Macho Man Randy Savage, Ric Flair, Roddy Piper, R.I.P. You know, again, these larger than life personalities, the Iron Sheik, Ultimate Warrior, you know, all these guys were wild, over the top kind of personalities, and it really matched the 80s sensibility and that kind of wildness that was going on. There's also a big push into Mexico too, kind of in the early 20th century, and it was kind of brought to the forefront by Salvador Luthroth. He founded the Empresa Mexicana de Lucha Libre, or Mexican Wrestling Enterprise, in 1933, and again that kind of brought this more the Mexican luchador, masked wrestler, and they'd always stay masked. And I don't know if anyone's ever seen the movie Nacho Libre, hilarious movie with Jack Black, a little bit in the vein of Napoleon Dynamite, low budget, that whole kind of, I mean, it was probably actually a little bit of a higher budget than Napoleon Dynamite, that's for sure. But again, it was that whole kind of lo-fi, really surrealist, almost like bizarre movie making, but it all surrounded this character who was a monk who wanted to be a luchador. He wanted to wrestle. And again, it's, you know, they wear masks, and, you know, it was more flamboyant at the time, in the early 20s and in the 30s. It was more of that flamboyant wrestling that then again inspired some of these second golden age wrestlers, right, to put on these big shows. So there was a lot of different wrestling federations, if you will, happening at the same time. The World Wrestling Federation, or the WWF, which used to be the WWWF, which was the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. They changed that in '79. It originally started in the 60s, and eventually the WWF was owned by Vince McMahon, and he was the first guy to coin the term sports entertainment. So again, that's that whole idea of this as being more than just sport. It's also entertainment. So again, starting to kind of allude at the fact that it wasn't all completely real. With these other wrestling federations that were all kind of competing for the top spot, McMahon created WrestleMania to kind of create a little bit of draw. So again, these became huge productions and these huge events that thousands of people would go to, and I believe they were pay-per-view. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but I believe that they were pay-per-view, and they again had huge draws, and it was like the whole year was leading up to WrestleMania, and all these different people were talking about, trying to get to WrestleMania and wrestle each other, and it was essentially like the Super Bowl of wrestling. During the early 1990s, the WWF was kind of being hindered, if you will, by competing brands and nagging legal troubles. That may or may not have alluded in my research I was doing. I didn't really see anything about the World Wildlife Fund, which is also WWF, which also was always on TV with the panda. There was like, I guess it's a myth, maybe it's real, but again, I couldn't confirm nor deny that the WWF the World Wildlife Fund pushed outbid or strong arm the WWF and the World Wrestling Foundation. But anyway, so they actually ended up changing it. They changed WWF to WWE eventually. Because of one of their biggest legal troubles was actually coming from the WCW, which was another wrestling foundation, which had, again, in the 90s was kind of taking over for the WWF. So they were like a little bit on their heels, kind of scrambling. WCW was, again, this kind of World Championship Wrestling. It was WCW stands for, and it was kind of like the complete opposite. Again, there was about 4 or 5 other wrestling foundations out there at the time, but these were like the two main ones on TV all the time, had the best stars. WCW was kind of like, I don't know exactly the analogy, but I guess like the Pepsi to WWF's Coke, very similar, but different. Some famous WCW wrestlers would be Sting, for instance, Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, Vader, Goldberg, who I mentioned before, Randy Savage, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and again, some of these I also mentioned when I was talking about the second golden age of WWF. And that all those guys used to be like, there are some wrestlers that were in the WWF. There were some wrestlers that went over the WCW because they were kind of poached over by the WCW. WWF was kind of becoming a little bit cartoonish at the time in their storylines. It was a little bit over the top, and WCW was a little bit more intense. Again, they're like soap operas, right? So it depended on kind of what you liked as a fan. Did you want that more flamboyant, wild moves, big jumps, lots of like edginess, or did you like kind of more flamboyance, or whatever it was, right? So Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Hulk Hogan actually started the New World Order, which is again in the WCW was this kind of new edgy group that again, was drawing that more late 90s kind of edgy fan base. During this whole time, the WWF was forced to change itself to overcome its competition. Like I said, they wanted to kind of change to that new WCW kind of new edgy kind of focus. Let's put it that way. They wanted to go more bloodshed, more violence, more profane language, more sexually lewd characters. They called it the Attitude Era, and it quickly dominated the style and nature of wrestling to become far more teen-oriented at the time. So again, it was really, really making it kind of go for that demographic that they knew wanted this wild stuff. Everyone who was into Jackass and everyone was into just more hardcore stuff. It was just a more hardcore sensibility at the time. And that eventually kind of pushed at the time the WWF back up into the top spot. And it also kind of ignited what they called the Monday Night Wars. And what the WCW put out was Monday Nitro, and the WWF put out Monday Night Raw. And they scratch that. They both came out obviously on Monday night, and it was like, what are you going to watch? You're going to watch WWF, or are you going to watch Monday Night Raw, or are you going to watch Monday Nitro, right? So, with the New World Order starting with Hulk, Kevin Nash, and Scott Hall. And Scott Hall actually used to be Razor Ramon in the WWF. And then he just kind of like dropped his persona and became Scott Hall. They started this, as they call it in the biz, a heel group. So these guys, there's heels and there's heroes, I believe. A heel obviously is just going to be, someone who is always the villain, and Hulk Hogan was always a hero, and he then switching over to this, it just created so much more draw. Hulk Hogan was getting a little bit older in his career, but it kind of reignited. Actually, the three of them, Kevin Nash was a little bit younger, but the three of them were kind of aging, but it kind of reignited that whole interest in like, oh man, these guys have gone bad. And again, it was that whole, like I remember kids in my school just doing like the kind of moves that they used to do just because it was again, they called it the Attitude Era. It was just that whole idea of, things were a little bit edgier in the late 90s. People didn't know what was going to happen in the year 2000. Was it all going to end? The Matrix came out. Like, what's happening? Everything was edgy. Meanwhile, there was, again, it was an interesting time. So the wrestling world kind of followed suit. So again, like I said, the WCW, with the Monday Night Wars starting, the WCW started also kind of gaining the upper hand with the New World Order. Like I said, they were getting more and more attention because of that group. Their storylines were edgier. They weren't cartoonish like the WWF. Basically, while the WWF and WCW were doing this, a whole other wrestling federation was kind of forming, and they called themselves the ECW, or the Extreme Championship Wrestling, or Extreme Championship Wrestling. And that was like an even more over the top. So, ECW adapted a hardcore style of wrestling and exposed the audience to a level of violence rarely seen in wrestling. The unorthodox style of moves, controversial storylines, and intense bloodthirst of the ECW made it intensely popular amongst many wrestling fans in the 18 to 25-year-old demographic. Its intense fan base, albeit a small constituency, reached near cultism in the late 90s. And inspired the hardcore style and other wrestling promotions, namely WWF and WCW. That whole sensibility, like I mentioned, kind of came to the head with the ECW. Now, now things kind of turn. This is the late 90s. They're dominating. Things are wild, really intense, hardcore. Year 2000 happens, 2001, life is kind of changing. The world is kind of changing. People are starting to go away from that kind of edgier stuff. There's more hope. Yeah, September 11th happened in 2001, which is awful and devastating and changed the security landscape for the world and travel and things. But generally speaking, pop culture wise, all that stuff is, sorry, I just kind of sounded like a transformer there. Was kind of craving that, Britney Spears starting to come up more boy band stuff, not that wasn't happening in the 90s, but that's what people were starting to focus their energy into a little bit more. Pop, things were starting to just get a little bit brighter, which was, again, hopeful, but at the same time, they weren't necessarily looking for that extreme edge, that you were getting. So in 2001, the WWF, that's when they renamed themselves WWE, like I mentioned. They actually, the WCW and ECW just folded, and WWF kind of bought them up. And essentially what happened was the WWF, or now the WWE, just kind of amalgamated everything. They had their own Monday Night Raw and Nitro, and they kind of just turned them into, like, again, they owned... Vince McMahon owned everything, and he kind of turned it into like two leagues, if you like, an American league and a national league, if you will, like in baseball. And sometimes they would compete against each other, and you'd have different wrestlers representing each one. There wasn't, I guess if you're like a wrestling connoisseur, you're probably gonna be yelling at me. There wasn't like a huge difference between the two of them. I think with Nitro coming from WCW, they probably tried to retain however that was going before, maybe a little bit, and Raw, in another sense, was maybe a little bit more extreme. But again, there's all these wrestlers too, and it's kind of funny. I was thinking with this podcast, do I show all these pictures? I wish I could. I wish I could show you videos. I wish I could show you all this stuff, but I don't have all the time. I don't know all the right stuff yet. But again, if you guys want to go check out all these names I've been dropping, like, amazing. Even some I haven't even mentioned, Kane, The Undertaker, who were they were both brothers, the Road Warriors, like I mentioned, plenty of tag teams out there. There's all this stuff. Really, really, again, these characters are wild. They're not like amazingly deep, but it's just it's just all about the entertainment. It's really interesting, the flamboyance of it. And again, the thought behind some of these characters is just tremendous. One time I actually did go, I'm just looking at my notes here. I did actually go check with my cousins. I believe we went to Monday Night Raw. It might have been Monday Nitro too. I'm sorry, Ingrid and Eric, but they loved it. I know my cousins were super into it, especially my cousin Eric. They came down from Northern Ontario, and we saw Monday Night Raw, I believe, in Toronto, and it was super cool. It was at the ACC. I think Batista was there at the time, a bunch of other wrestlers. Obviously this stuff is like simultaneously happening all over North America, so these wrestlers can't really be everywhere at the same time. So, you kind of expect to see like all these wrestlers, but you're only really going to get, who can show up that day and who's like around Toronto, I'm assuming. So, it was really interesting seeing that and being in the stadium in person and seeing it. We weren't like absolutely close. I think we had a pair of binoculars, but we weren't like crazy close. So it wasn't like we were getting like yelled at or like sweat flying at us, or like we didn't hold up signs. Actually, we might have held up signs. I think I was probably like, oh my gosh, maybe like 12 or 13 potentially at the time. And it was just really interesting. Again, the whole entertainment factor, light shows, pyrotechnics, all that really interesting stuff. Each wrestler like has their own entry music, which is really interesting. My cousins Ingrid and Eric and I used to play the WWE created like a wrestling game. I think it was like Raw versus Nitro or whatever, and you could play like a video game and wrestle against each other and stuff, and you could make your own wrestler and do all this stuff, and you could choose their entry song. And each wrestler in professional wrestling too usually comes into this entry song, and there's usually this whole cool thing where, you know, if someone's, you know, talking to the audience or something, all of a sudden they hear someone's entry music come on, they all of a sudden know who's coming in, which is so super cool. Stone Cold Steve Austin, who we haven't mentioned yet, he's up there too. You know, he's again that kind of like anti-hero almost that you see a lot in wrestling too. You don't just get the heels, but you get somewhere in between the heel and the hero, and it's really cool. You know, The Rock was like that too. And it's cool. Again, you get to see all these wrestlers, and they take from each other, and they are inspired by each other in that way. I mean, and it was funny when me and my cousins went to go see Monday Night Raw. You know, we're just watching, having our time wrestling, and all of a sudden all the lights go out and the music comes on. Talk about music. The music comes on, and it's the Undertaker's music, and everyone knows, oh God, it's Undertaker. And two guys were wrestling before the lights came on. Before the lights went out, and all of a sudden they come back on, and the Undertaker is standing on stage, which is super wild. And I thought it was pretty cool. And again, it's really entertaining, and someone you don't expect to see. And that becomes a whole aspect of it when you go to the events. I'm assuming you don't expect who's going to show up, which again is fun. And it was interesting, again, being able to see it and witness it in person, just to see what it's all about. Because I guess at the time it would have been around like probably 2004, 2003, maybe even. It was that kind of rebirth again, the changing of the guard. WWF had amalgamated into WWE. They had everybody, and it was just kind of a new, John Cena was on the scene, and all these kind of new era, if you will, wrestlers who a lot of them are famous. Obviously, The Rock and John Cena are probably the most famous from. Obviously Batista too. Dave Batista, he's in all the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. Right on for him. Oh, he's also in the new Blade Runner too, which is great. If you've ever seen that one, check that one, Blade Runner 2049 or whatever. But this kind of takes me around to this whole thing. I was thinking about WWE and thinking about professional wrestling in general, and I was kind of thinking, what is the root of this thing? Like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, because that essence of chance is removed, and someone has decided, or it's already been, or we have a general idea of probably who's going to win, because a lot of these matches that get set up, it's a really famous guy versus someone who you've never heard of, and almost always that person you've never heard of is going to lose. But what about that? Why do people keep coming back to that whole thing? Because again, that then deems it fake in the eyes of sports, right? Because any competition in sports, it should be, if the playing field is fair, each team should have an equal opportunity at actually winning the game. Obviously some teams might be stacked, but if you somehow were able to find equally matched players, there is this element of chance. Any game for that matter, you don't really know who's going to win when you start the game, or you shouldn't. And if you don't, it adds more excitement to the game. And that brings us to this concept of kayfabe. In wrestling, it's also called work, or worked. It's as a noun. It's the portrayal of staged events within the industry as real or true, specifically the portrayal of competition, rivalries, and relationships between participants as being genuine and not staged. So it's the suspension of disbelief, essentially, that these people out there are playing these characters, and they actually have these relationships with each other. There were stories that used to come out in the 70s and 80s when these wrestlers were still out and it was still essentially accepted that this was a real sport, that you'd see, two guys, Hacksaw Jim Duggan and, Jake the Snake Roberts were seen, drinking a beer somewhere. And it's like, these guys are supposed to be enemies or whatever. And now they're together. People started questioning it. Again, people started questioning the legitimacy, and eventually people just came out and said, yeah, it's wrestling entertainment. We're not trying to fool anyone here. But again, that's that whole idea of kayfabe, because that whole concept came out years ago, and you'd think that wrestling would never exist ever again, but it still exists to this day. So there's something about this concept of kayfabe that people crave. They want the illusion that there's two entities, there's competition. Actually, I'm listening to a great podcast right now called Talking Sopranos, and it's got me on the Sopranos right now. And there's this really interesting scene. Sorry, Scott Barker, if you're listening. There's this really interesting scene in The Sopranos where Tony, the main character, is in the hospital for a while, and another guy that he's in the hospital with is this kind of genius character. He used to work at Bell Laboratories, which is he's like an engineer kind of guy, physicist, I believe, astrophysicist, and he is talking to Tony about all kinds of like wild philosophical stuff, because Tony is recovering from a gunshot wound. And they end up watching a boxing match. There's a really important boxing match that comes on. And they ask this genius professor guy, who do you think's going to win the boxing match or whatever, right? The fight. And the doctor goes, well, it's an illusion that they are two entities. We just perceive them as two. They're both a part of a system and a part of a universe that is ongoing and is all one. We choose to perceive them as separate. Just like, we are all one in this universe, in that sense that we are reflections of ourselves in a way that I am you and you are me, because if we're all part of this collective unconsciousness or some type of connection, even through generations and memories and the oral tradition that's passed down, we are connected with all the human beings on this planet, especially the fact that we all live on this planet together. And many, many levels of that, and I've mentioned it before, and I truly believe that there's this connection that exists with all of us, and I think we all know that deep down inside. But this concept of kayfabe allows us to kind of suspend that for a moment and say, oh, look at these people, they're battling against each other, and they have all these problems and conflicts and everything, but don't worry, it's all going to work itself out. Someone's already decided it. So again, it's this almost microcosm of, maybe it's a wish fulfillment in the fact that people want to think, hey, someone has already decided what's going to happen, and we're just out here kayfabing it up. We're working it. We're getting it done. But, there's something that we crave potentially with that kayfabe. And, maybe it almost existed in gladiatorial combat, because we knew at the end of the day, someone was going to be maimed. When you put a guy into a giant arena with like 10 lions, like, he's probably not going to win. But, people still wanted to see that, right? And there's something about that, people that crave that. Again, it's that suspension of disbelief where you go, hey, maybe this guy will kill all these 9 lions. You never know. But, I think nowadays, pro wrestling isn't so much in the forefront. It still exists. Again, you still have celebrities that come from the pro wrestling world. But it's like this kayfabe has almost switched to politics and the government. Like, if you can look at what Trump did, not to harp on that, or even just how politicians do, in the federal and large governments, there's this promise when they're being elected, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do all this stuff. Meanwhile, they're doing something completely different. So it's almost a kayfabe in the sense that they're showing us one thing, but they're doing something else. And it's not necessarily a desirable effect, probably for us as the lowly people that the government, calls the shots for. But it's like, again, we want to believe, oh yeah, the government, they're going to do the best. They have our best interest involved in all this stuff. And that might not necessarily be the case. They might be the heel in this situation. And it's a really interesting thought. That's actually something that I think Chad Kulchin brought up on the 10-minute podcast too, is that's where the new kayfabe is that there's always going to be some kind of like, I think in Japanese known as kabuki, where it's just like you're completely, showing something that is over the top and wild and a oversimplification of the situation. And we're just kind of suspending our disbelief and thinking, hey, yeah, it's all going to be for the best. So maybe that's how I kind of put it, a little bit more of a grandiose idea on the fact, on the topic of pro wrestling. But, that's what it got me thinking. And, like I said, we want to hear from you. If you got anything to tell us and you got anything to say about the podcast, any topics you want to let us know, please reach out. Let us know. Twitter, Instagram, however you want to do it. If you want to support the podcast, please check out our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. Different levels of support there. And again, like I always say at the end of the podcast, please, if you go tell one friend, we're going to double our podcast, our podcast listeners just like that. So tell your friends, subscribe to the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the bell, so when you get the new videos, and rate and review the podcast if you can too. We love you. Go out there and go check out some old wrestling, brother.